This program and the associated written materials are provided for informational purposes only and are not intended and must not be taken as legal advice on any particular set of facts or circumstances. You should not act or refrain from acting on the basis of any content included in this program without seeking legal or other professional advice on your specific matter. This program contains general information and may not reflect current legal developments or address your specific situation. This program and the associated written materials are not intended as a solicitation.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Raucher, and I'm happy to be here today under what are some unhappy circumstances to hopefully give folks in the business community some useful information as it relates to insurance and their insurance claims. I'm going to be the first speaker, and we're each going to introduce ourselves a little bit as we go, but I want to start by being sure to thank Sam Bruchey and Michael Haugen, who you will be hearing from shortly, for agreeing to participate with me here today. I practice at a firm called Reuben, Raucher, and Blum, and I primarily represent policyholders in first-party and third-party insurance coverage disputes. What we're going to talk about today will fall entirely under first-party claims, namely property claims or fire-related claims. I'm going to start by giving you all an overview of the types of coverages that may be available to compensate businesses for losses that they have suffered in these terrible wildfires. Not every policy will contain each of these coverages, but they're things for you to look for and ask questions about, hopefully. Sam is then going to dive into some of the considerations that go into actually preparing your BI, business interruption or business income claim, especially something that's often a topic of controversy between policyholder and insurance company, which is the period of restoration, which we'll talk about more. And then Michael is going to give you, Michael's the non-lawyer here today, and he's going to dive into some of the nitty-gritty accounting issues that come up on these claims, coming at it from the perspective of someone who's typically hired by the insurance company. And he's going to let you know some of what you might be able to expect in terms of the process of going through one of these kinds of claims. I encourage you to use the Q&A feature in the Zoom to ask questions. If we're able to, we may try to address some of those questions in the course of our respective sections, and or we may decide to hold them to the end, depending on how things go. So with that, if I could have the next slide, please. I just wanted to start with a general discussion or description of what is meant by BI coverage. You'll see that term. It means both business income coverage, loss of business income, as well as sometimes referred to as business interruption coverage. And there are a number of species of this kind of coverage that we'll see. But fundamentally, I took from an pretty old California Court of Appeal case an overview of what the purpose of this kind of coverage is. And fundamentally, it's to indemnify the insured against losses arising from his inability to continue the normal operation and functions of his business, consequent, meaning resulting from, the destruction of the building, plant, or parts thereof. So importantly, there has to be a physical loss. We'll talk more about that in a minute. That is causing a business to suffer losses. That's the 30,000-foot view of what this type of coverage is. But if we go to the next slide, this is taken from an actual policy, a fairly standard type of business income loss coverage. And the first part is the definition of what business income means, and Sam and Michael are going to get into some of the detail on that in a bit. But before you even get to that point, you have to fall within the grant of coverage. The grant of coverage here contains a lot of different fundamental terms that we're going to go through. So we will pay for the actual loss of business income you sustained due to the necessary suspension of your operations during the period of restoration. And you see the words suspension, operations, and period of restoration are in quotes. That's because they're defined elsewhere in the policy. And we'll get into some of those specifics. The suspension must be caused by direct physical loss of or damage to property at the described premises. So as I mentioned earlier, in order for this coverage to come into effect, there has to be a physical loss at the described premises. And then not only must there be a physical loss, the loss or damage must be caused by or result from a covered cause of loss. So in these first-party business policies, there are all kinds of different policies. Sometimes they are tied to particular causes of loss, and sometimes they're more general. And we'll take a look at that in just a minute. Okay, so next slide. So starting sort of from the end of the definition, you have to first look at whether there's a covered cause of loss. Now, the good news for most folks who had this type of wildfire claim is that here the question of whether there's a covered cause of loss should presumably be a fairly binary proposition, either yes or no. Either your policy covers fire or it doesn't cover fire. So hopefully there won't be too much controversy over this, but I did think it's worth pointing out that these kinds of first-party policies typically come in two different types. One is called an all-risk policy, meaning that the property insurance covers basically any cause unless it's specifically excluded from the policy, versus a named peril policy where the policy only covers certain listed causes. So if you've got a named peril policy and fire is not named as one of your specified causes, then you're probably not going to have coverage. The only other thing I wanted to say about covered cause of loss is that in some cases, your business may not have burned, but it may have suffered significant smoke damage. And that, I think, generally would qualify as fire damage, but some policies specifically call out smoke as a separately covered cause of loss. So that's an area to think about that could potentially be raised by an insurance company. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So again, working backwards in that definition, the next question is, was there property damage? Again, in general, this is going to be fairly easy to figure out. If your business burned down, clearly there is physical loss, right? We start getting into maybe closer questions or more interesting questions again when you talk about things like smoke. Is there visible smoke damage in the business? If so, then I think it's fairly non-controversial that there was physical damage. But sometimes it can be more indirect. Like, what if smoke from wildfires caused health concerns about air quality where the business was located and the business shut down? There's lots of ash or things like that. That issue has not specifically been decided under California law, although in general, most states do find that that can qualify. And in a relatively recent case having to do with COVID, where they found that COVID did not constitute physical loss, the court nonetheless held that as a general matter, where a structure is contaminated such that the contamination seriously impairs or destroys its function, that could constitute direct physical loss. The last thing I want to say on this topic is that there is a very recent, like January 10th, less than a month old case called Bottega LLC versus National Surety by a federal district court in Northern California, arising out of the 2017 North Bay fires, in which the issue is whether smoke damage caused a restaurant's suspension of operations. And in that case, the court found that it was not clear one way or the other, but that there was evidence that there was such causation, so that the case was allowed to proceed to trial. So that's an example of, the kind of fight that can potentially happen in these kinds of cases. And, notably, that's from the 2017 fires. And so here we are 8 years later. Hopefully, if you have this kind of a claim, you won't get into that kind of protracted litigation. We can go on to the next slide. We also saw that there needs to be a suspension of operations in order to invoke the BI coverage. And it's worth noting that older forms required a complete cessation of activities to be entitled to coverage. But more recent policy forms define suspension as the partial or complete cessation of your business activities. Or sometimes you'll see coverage for interruption, whether total or partial. So the fact that your business may not have been completely out of business for a period of time is not necessarily, hopefully not a bar to BI coverage. And what does that term operations mean? Well, that's another defined term. It means your business activities occurring at the described premises, so pretty broad. Or in the case of a rental property, it means tenantability of the described premises when there's rental value coverage. And I'll say a little bit more about rental value coverage in a minute. But I did want to flag that business doesn't just necessarily mean a store or a restaurant. It can also be a piece of property that's held for rental purposes. Okay, next slide, please. Something that unfortunately may come up for some folks is, well, what if there is no resumption of operations? What if the devastation was just so total and complete that the business owner is unable or doesn't want to resume the business? In that case, you may still be entitled to coverage. The policy form that I was looking at as the basis for this presentation specifically says if you do not resume operations or do not resume operations as quickly as possible, we'll pay based on the length of time it would have taken to resume operations as quickly as possible. So it's not necessarily a requirement that you actually do resume operations in order to be entitled to some benefits. Okay, next slide. That is the business income part of compensation in these kinds of situations. There's several other coverages that most policies have in the case of extra expense, or in the case of some of these others that are somewhat less common, but I think still worth talking about. The extra expense coverage is not paying you for your lost income. It's paying for expenses that you would not have otherwise incurred to continue operations at the described premises or at replacement premises or temporary locations, including relocation expenses, etc. So examples of this kind of coverage could be equipment rental, the need to rent temporary office space, employee overtime that would not have otherwise been incurred in dealing with the efforts to continue operations. Okay, next slide, please. So what's the difference? Just to reiterate, difference between business income and extra expenses. Business income insurance helps replace lost net income that would have been earned, as well as to reimburse usual business expenses if your business can't operate for some period of time. Whereas the extra expense coverage helps cover extra costs that come up to allow your business to continue to function at some level from a temporary location while you're making repairs. Okay, next slide, please. So this civil authority coverage is an exception to the rule that I stated that you need a physical loss in order to get a benefit. There needs to be a physical loss, but it doesn't necessarily need to be to your property. And so what civil authority applies when there are evacuation orders, which obviously we had in these recent wildfires, and they apply to lost income and extra expenses caused by action of civil authority that prohibits access to the described premises. The civil authority action must be due to direct physical loss of or damage to property at locations other than the described premises. So if you're in an evacuation zone, you weren't able to do business, but you were lucky enough to survive the fires, but your neighbor or neighbors a block or half a mile or whatever down the street did suffer damage, then you may be entitled to lost business income and extra expense coverage under the civil authority coverage. Next slide, please. Some businesses might also have something called a dependent properties coverage, where you weren't even in the fire zone or the evacuation zone, but there are properties upon which your business depends in some way, shape, or form that were, and that they suffered physical loss, and that affected your business. But what does that mean? What is a dependent property? We go to the next slide. Dependent property means a property operated by others, not by you, that falls into one of those four categories, including a property that delivers materials or services to you that you depend on and in order to make your business work. Or it can be a property that's been damaged that accepts your products and services, and they're now no longer able to do that, and therefore you've suffered lost income. And manufacturing, don't know that that's going to be a major issue for these fires. Maybe attract customers to your business. So what does that mean? Well, it means that if a anchor tenant in a mall that is designed to attract customers to the mall is damaged, but your property is not damaged, and now there's less traffic going to the mall, then that could be a dependent property situation. Okay. Couple more points. Next slide, please. Imminent peril. This is somewhat similar to extra expense coverage, but it's really specific to the entertainment industry generally, where if there's an impending natural disaster like an oncoming fire and you need to, you incur expenses to avoid the peril, then you can cover those expenses, but don't know how often that's going to come up. Next slide, please. Loss of rental income I mentioned earlier. This is an additional or alternative form of lost business income coverage, and specifically applying in situations where your business is renting out space, and it now can no longer do that, and you can recover lost rental value. I'm going long, so go to the next slide. Extended business income. This is a type of coverage that not every policy has, but if you do have it, that means is that not only are you covered for your lost income during the period of restoration, you're also covered for some period of time after you're back into your space and are resuming normal operations until you get back to your normal level of operations. So that's a good additional coverage. Although it is typically limited to some time period like 180 days. So if you never get back to your normal level for whatever reason, the coverage cuts off at that point. Which brings me to my last slide, my last point, which is you also need to look at the policy limits in your particular policy. They can be based on a number of days. They can be based on They can be based on a set amount that's agreed on a per day basis, or they can be based on a total dollar amount. So, I just threw an example in of the different, some different kinds of limits that may apply to different kinds of coverages. So that's something you also have to look at closely. And just as a reminder, the coverage, unless you have that extended business income coverage, is limited to the period of restoration. So the question then becomes, what's the reasonable period of restoration? And for that and some other practical questions, I'm now going to turn it over to Sam.
Thanks, Steve. So good afternoon, everyone. My name again is Sam Bruchey, and I am a partner at Shernoff, Bidart, Echeverria. And we are a firm that specializes in representing insurance policyholders when they have disputes against their insurance companies. We are litigators. And so for the better part of 20 years, I've been representing people and individuals after they have submitted a claim and have had that claim denied or only paid in part. And I have had a lot of cases involving business income claims that have not been paid in full. And so what I hope to do is expand upon some of the basics that Steve has started to lay out, and also give some tips that I hope can help you navigate a claim process that will result in a full and fair payment for your business income losses. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the first and very basic question is, what is a business interruption loss? Well, a business interruption or a business income loss is the amount of earnings that your business would have generated but for the loss event. And that could be a fire, could be a water event. And in this instance, we are gathered here today certainly because of the fire, but it is a projection of what your business would have earned had it not been for the fire. But that projection must subtract any actual earnings that your business is able to generate after the loss event. So take, for an example, you have a hardware store and the fire causes damage to the brick and mortar location and results in a suspension of that physical operation. You can file a business income claim and calculate the amount of earnings that you would have generated had it not been for that suspension. But if you're able to sell any of your products, either online or otherwise, during the period of restoration, those sales earnings must be deducted from the calculation. And a lot of insurance policies will expressly obligate insureds to subtract those actual earnings. And a failure to do so can generate a lot of unwanted scrutiny by the insurance company on your claim, which can, in certain cases, result in your claim being referred to an insurance company's special investigations unit, which would look into the possibility of fraud, and sometimes could even result in a denial of coverage. So it's supremely important that you be aware of actual earnings that you're able to generate after the suspension and notify the insurance company of them and subtract them from your business income calculations. Next slide, please. Typically, business income calculations are done in one of two ways. It's either a before versus after method, or it's a yardstick method. And in my experience, with nearly no exception, I see insurance companies analyzing and calculating a company's business income losses by looking at the before versus after. And that is simply done where historical data and financial information is analyzed, and information prior to the date of the loss, and is relied upon to calculate the reasonable amount that would have been generated by the company had the loss not occurred. Next slide, please. These insurance policies that contain business income coverage, as Steve mentioned, provide coverage for losses sustained during the period of restoration. So what does that mean? A period of restoration is a period of time during which your business operations are suspended. And it begins typically one of two ways, either on the date of loss or after the completion of a waiting period. A waiting period is a specified period of time identified in the policy that begins on the date of loss. Typically, it's 30 days or 60 days. And in a policy that contains a waiting period, a period of restoration would begin after the completion of the waiting period. Next slide. A period of restoration typically ends in the earliest of the following scenarios. Number one is the date by which the damaged property should be repaired or rebuilt, or the date when business operations are resumed, or the date when the business income coverage in the policy ends. And I want to emphasize that with regard to that first scenario, insurance companies appropriately calculate the length of time that it should take a business to be repaired or rebuilt. Meaning, for example, if you hire a contractor to repair the fire damage to your business, and that contractor makes mistakes in the job that he's doing, any delays that may result from those mistakes will not be included in the period of restoration. On the other hand, if your business is fire damaged at a time when many other businesses are fire damaged, and it takes you longer to rebuild your operation because everyone else is trying to hire the same contractors, that additional time that it takes because of the circumstances that you're in are not going to be used against you. They will be included in the period of restoration. Next slide. Another important thing to keep in mind with respect to the period of restoration is that it doesn't necessarily end on the date when your policy term expires. The kind of policies that we're talking about in these cases are commercial business properties, commercial property policies, and they typically have a 1-year term. And they also typically include a 12-month business income period. So let's say your policy begins on January 1st, and you suffer a covered loss in November. You still have up to 12 months of business income coverage, even though your policy will remain in force for only an additional month. Next slide, please. When you are calculating your business income losses, it's expected that you will deduct from the revenues that you project your business would have earned costs that you will have saved by the suspension of your business. And that's customary and expected. On the other hand, you need not subtract any costs that you continue to incur notwithstanding the suspension of your operation. So for example, if you continue to pay rent, if you continue to pay utility bills or postage expenses, those continuing expenses are included in and not deducted from the calculation of your business income loss. Now, I am not a CPA. And what I always do in cases where we have to calculate the true amount of an insured's business income loss is I retain a CPA. And it's important to know that even during the claim process that you're navigating, there may be coverage for the costs of services provided by an accountant or a CPA. And the provisions in a policy that typically can provide that coverage are inventory appraisal provisions or claim expense provisions. And sometimes policies include a professional fees coverage provision. So it's very important that you take a look at your policy, take a careful look at it, and determine whether it has coverage for those kinds of expenses. And if you're not a CPA, or if you're not a numbers person in general, you should bring in a CPA who can help you calculate accurately the amount of your business income losses. Next slide, please. This next slide provides a lot of information about the kinds of documents that are more reliable, and how financial documents, if they are based upon testable assumptions, are typically more reliable. It may not be appropriate for smaller businesses, but I think that this just sort of underscores the importance of retaining a CPA or an expert who can help you gather information from financial records that are dependable and accurate. Because during the claim process, you're going to be required to turn over financial information to the insurance company that will substantiate your calculation of your business income losses. Next slide. And, here lies an interesting sort of pivot point. People and businesses enjoy privacy rights, and those privacy rights in certain circumstances may shield them from an obligation to turn over financial information, but those rights are not absolute. And in a claim scenario where you're asking an insurance company to compensate you for your financial losses, you are putting your financial interests, center stage, and you will have an obligation to provide financial documents that will prove what you claim your losses to be. And so if you take a position where you say that your financial documentation is privileged and you have a right to privacy and you need not turn it over, you are running the risk of having your claim denied, because you have an obligation to cooperate in the claim process. And cooperation means you have to allow the insurance company to investigate and quantify the amount of your business income losses. And so you're going to have to turn over financial documents. Typically, in these situations, we see insureds turning over profit and loss statements, balance sheets, sometimes bank records. Insurance companies will ask for all kinds of financial documents. And it's important that you cooperate. But I want you to understand that you should look very carefully at the documents that you turn over and make certain that there isn't information in them that is inconsistent with your calculations of your losses. And we see that sometimes, unfortunately, in tax returns. So in situations where insured businesses rely upon an accountant to prepare tax returns, sometimes we see a calculation of the cost of goods sold, a very high percentage of the overall revenues. And in tax returns, we see that because an increased percentage of a cost of goods sold will have the effect of reducing your taxable income. But in a claim scenario, the higher the percentage of cost of goods sold, the less your profits will be and the less insurance coverage you can expect to receive. So by all means, you should be entirely honest and forthcoming in the presentation of your claim, but you should also be very aware of the information that's contained in the financial documents that are prepared over the course of running of your business. Next slide, please. During a business income claim, insurance companies are going to, in the before versus after approach, take a look at the performance of your business prior to the date of loss, and it's appropriate to do so. For new businesses, however, the level of profitability at the outset may not be indicative of how profitable the business was just prior to the loss, or how profitable it would have been had it not been for the loss. So it's very important to accurately calculate and define a length of time prior to the loss that reflects what the level of business that you would have done had it not been for the loss. So I'm litigating a case involving a business that was suspended. That was a new business. It had only been in operation for 3 years. And its performance was quickly escalating 1 year to the next up until the time of loss. And so we made certain that the insurance company looked at a shorter period of time prior to the loss because that was more indicative of how the business would have been expected to perform had it not been for the loss. When businesses define a pre-loss period of time that they are going to examine as part of their calculations of what your business income losses are, they start with the total revenue, and then they calculate the number of days of operation during that pre-loss period of time. This is another point that warrants emphasis. It is absolutely necessary that the insurance company accurately calculate the number of days in which the business was actually open for operation, because it is that total number of days of operation that they will use to calculate an average daily revenue. And if there are more days of operation that are taken into consideration in that calculation, that's going to reduce the average daily revenue calculation. So you have to be certain that the insurance company is accurately taking into consideration days when the business was closed. So those are some important sort of nuts and bolts issues that I hope will be helpful in navigating a claim process. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Michael.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks, Steve, for setting the stage for us. Very well done. My name is Michael Haugen. I am a Senior Vice President of Economic Damages and Valuations for JS Held, which is a multidisciplinary consulting firm. In my practice, in my career, I've spent over 16 years working predominantly to measure business interruption losses. And I wish I could say that this was a better time for me to be speaking to you all. My heart goes out to everyone that's dealing with such catastrophic consequences of these wildfires. And hopefully my goal today is to give you a little insights as the accountant who's measuring the losses and providing recommendations as to what the loss measurement is, how these things work, and how we can clear things up for you as business owners to help make things easier. Next slide, please. So I'd like to start with this quick little reconciliation here. It's what I call a bottom-up, top-down reconciliation. We've heard Steve speak to the fact that the policy language describes the business interruption or business income coverage as an amount that is to be measured as the net income plus continuing expenses. We've heard Sam explain that it's the revenues less the saved expenses. There's revenue and earnings and income and net income values being thrown around. So let me try and clear the air a little bit and help you all understand how no matter whether you calculate the loss from the bottom-up approach, which is the net income plus the continuing expenses, or the top-down approach, which is the revenue lost less the saved expenses, you're going to get to the same conclusion of business income loss and how that measure is intended to make business owners whole from a net income perspective, of course, before we're considering income taxes. So this little chart will help walk us through that. And on the left-hand side, you can see the column that says projected. The projected values are what we were expecting the business would have accomplished, this hypothetical business, if not for a catastrophic loss that destroys the property in its entirety. And in this period of time, we're expecting the revenues would have been $100. The cost of sales to earn that revenue would have been $40. The gross profit would have been $60. There would have been additional operating expenses such as payroll, rent, and utilities that total $55. And so in this example, in the yellow bottom, in the far left on the bottom in yellow is the net income value of $5. That's the expected net income that would have been realized if not for the fire. In the actual column right next to it, because this business is completely closed in this scenario, there's zero revenue. There's zero cost of sales because there is no revenue, but some payroll expenses have continued. Let's say that the business owner decides to pay some of its staff despite being closed. They want to retain key people for when they reopen. There's a $15 continuing payroll expense. Rent expense discontinues and utilities discontinue, assuming the building is entirely gone. In this instance, we've got a negative $15 loss because we've got $15 of expenses without any revenue. If you add up the net income that would have been realized if not for the loss, the $5 projected, plus the continuing expenses of $15, you're going to get to a $20 business income loss. What does that $20 do? It reimburses you for your $15 of continuing payroll and puts the $5 of net profit back in your pocket that we were expecting would have been realized if not for the covered peril. On the flip side, and looking at it differently but getting to the same conclusion, if you look at the far right in green, you can see that we've got $100 of lost revenue, less $40 of cost of sales. Those are expenses saved. They would have been 40, they were actually 0, so you've got $40 in savings. And you have $40 of saved operating expenses, 15 in payroll, 20 in rent, and 5 in utility expenses. So in this instance, when you have $60 gross profit loss less $40 of saved expenses, you get to the same $20 loss. The reason I want to highlight this is because you may see the measurement of your business income loss as a business owner calculated as Sam explained, revenue less saved expenses. You may see it calculated as the net income plus continuing expenses. Both measures get to the same conclusions. So hopefully that clears things up a little bit in terms of the mechanics of the calculations. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about what you might be able to expect in terms of the process of working with an accountant such as myself to measure the business income loss claim and provide a recommendation to the insurance company as to the loss that should be considered. Now, keep in mind, anytime you're working with an accountant that's working for or on behalf of the insurance company, such as myself in some instances, I am not an adjuster. We do not make any coverage decisions. So there's going to be an interplay. We've talked a lot about all the different coverage elements that come into the measurement of the loss. Be aware that the accountants do not make any coverage decisions. And if you have coverage questions, you're likely to be referred to the adjuster at the insurance company to make those decisions and provide that information that is needed to the loss measurement expert to measure the loss. So part of the process that you might be able to expect is an introduction, a case kickoff call. This is your opportunity as the business owner to explain to the loss measurement expert, the forensic accountant, the CPA, such as myself, what is unique about your business and what are the key issues that you think should be considered in the measure of the loss. What are your biggest concerns? Explain those to the accountant right off the bat, and hopefully they can help address them. Once you have that case kickoff call, you're likely to receive a request for records. It might come in the form of an email that bullet points the different types of accounting records that are being requested to start the measurement of the loss. And typically that request for records is unique to the very specific aspects of your claim. Every claim is different. No claim is the same, whether it's the unique facts and circumstances of your own business, how it was affected by the covered peril, or the coverage parameters that apply. So you can expect the document request to be tailored to your specific claim. Once you provide a response to that initial request, I'm going to review the records that have been produced and start putting together an initial loss estimate. In that process, it's likely that I'm going to come up with additional questions that I need some answers to, and I might circle back to you as a business owner to ask for clarifying information about the financial records or about something that doesn't make sense to me, and we'll address those follow-up questions. Once those questions are addressed and once all of the information that has been requested has been produced, I'm going to put together an initial loss estimate. That initial loss estimate may not be a total loss estimate. It may consider only a period of time, even though the total period of restoration, as was previously discussed, may be longer than the initial loss estimate. It's going to be an initial calculation that looks at, hey, what is this looking like? And how is it that we need to update this initial loss estimate with the passage of time? And that's what I refer to as interim updates. The actual loss sustained may not be able to be measured for a period of time, depending on the facts and circumstances of a case. So for example, if you as a business owner are able to resume any operations, whether at a temporary location or at your existing facility, in order to measure the loss, the measurement expert is going to need to know what your actual continuing revenues and expenses are. So there may be a period of time where we get together some initial documentation, we come up with initial loss estimate, but in order to true it up to an actual loss sustained, we have to gather additional data of revenues and expenses after the date of loss that's necessary to measure the loss and then ultimately provide the recommendation. So the point of this discussion and this highlight, the key takeaway is to expect an interactive process. It's not typically a just here's the documentation, we're done. It's typically a scenario where you can expect to go back and forth with a measurement expert to reach the right conclusion. Next slide, please. So what are some of the common loss measurement questions that I see as a forensic accountant, and how is it that I might be able to help answer those questions for you? One of the most common things that I get asked right off the bat is I've got bills to pay. When can I expect to get paid by the insurance company? Keep in mind that you may ask a forensic accountant that question. It's not a question for the forensic accountant. We do not make decisions on when payments are made. The insurance company does. So that being said, it is relevant to consider that if you are going to go ask the insurance company for an advance payment, for example, against your insurance policy on the business interruption coverage, the insurance company may come back to me and as the loss measurement expert and say, hey, do you have enough data to consider providing an advance recommendation? And if I don't yet have initial documentation that's necessary to come up with that estimate, I may not be able to say yes. So the point here is that when you're working with a forensic accountant and you're hoping to get payment sooner rather than later, it is beneficial for you as a business owner to provide records in response to initial document requests as soon as possible. It's also relevant to understand that there can be some scenarios where even if you're asking for payment of something like payroll, where you say, look, I just want to get my payroll paid, can you advance me money to pay my payroll? Whether or not the insurance loss will include all of your claimed payroll or not is going to be dependent on whether or not there's an expectation that the business would have operated at a profit or a loss if not for the covered peril. So there can be some scenarios where just expecting continuing expenses to be repaid may not be the case, and that's why additional information is always relevant to consider producing so that that recommendation can be provided. Boom or bust. Business boom or bust. What do I mean by that? There are some instances where business conditions that are caused by a wide area impact might be claimed to have created a favorable environment, if not for covered peril to a specific location. On the flip side, there can be scenarios where a wide area impact because of a covered peril may make conditions that are less favorable even once operations have resumed, for example, and whether or not the business income loss measure can consider that boom or that bust in the measure of loss is something that is going to be case specific. It's going to be a coverage decision. But most often my experience has been that that type of wide area impact is not something that's considered in a business income loss measure. Why must I provide so much data? Sam spoke a little bit to the idea that the goal of the business income measure is to consider what would have happened, what is most likely to have happened if not for the covered peril. Getting data going back in history helps us come up with that estimate as loss measurement experts. Consideration might be given to things like seasonality, trending, how the future may have been different from the past. So depending on what the loss period is, there may be a request for data that goes back further in history. There may be a request for data that goes back less far back into history. So it's all to say that the request for data may be more broad than just looking at the last year, for example, and there's good reason for it. to make sure that we get to the right number. How can I help expedite things? And this kind of goes back to the first question. How can you as business owners help expedite getting an insurance payment? I think some of the key tips I can give you are when you get a document request, provide a complete response to the document request. That doesn't mean you have to hold everything until everything's ready to go, but don't provide only a partial response because it's just going to require a follow-up and it's going to delay things from proceeding. If you don't understand what is being asked for or the reason that it's being asked for in terms of the document request, ask a clarifying question. Go back to the person asking for the information and ask a clarifying question rather than taking a guess, so that the person that's asking for the data gets the right data that they need to get things moving as quickly as possible. If you can produce data in electronic format, such as Microsoft Excel, exporting your accounting data, your profit and loss statements into Excel or your sales data, do so. Doing so will help expedite review of that data. If you get follow-up requests from accountants, respond promptly. All of these things can help expedite review and a recommendation on a loss. Next slide, please. This is provided as an example of the types of documents that may be requested. Now, keep in mind, as I said before, every single case is measured for its own merits, based on the facts and circumstances that apply to it, as well as any specific coverage that applies to it. So this is more or less a boilerplate of some of the types of documents that may be considered. It's not necessarily what will be considered if you file a claim, nor is it exhaustive. There can be other things that are considered, but I thought this might be helpful to provide a list so that in the event that you want to start perhaps gathering some of the information that may be requested now, you have this as a reference point. One of the common things that I see happening in scenarios like the wildfires that brought up this presentation is that there can be instances where data is lost. There can be what I call record availability constraints. So if data is lost, it can create a challenge of how is it that you're supposed to produce the data that's being requested to measure a loss if it was lost in a fire. And in that instance, I want to encourage you to work with the accountant that's requesting data to get creative. Do you have access to cloud-based accounting systems that maintain the data that weren't destroyed in the fire? Is your point of sale system that maintains your sales detail report a cloud-based system where you can access data? Is your payroll data by a payroll provider whose systems weren't affected by the fire? Can you get your tax return transcripts from the IRS if you don't have them readily available? Or other taxing authorities in terms of your sales and use taxes or your lodging taxes, things of that nature. There's ways that you can work with record availability constraints to address such limitations. And that is what I have to share to wrap this thing up. And I'd like to open it up now to any questions that the group may have for us to address.
Michael and Sam, thank you both. Michael, that last point about availability of records was such a terrific point, something I should have thought of, but really had not thought about very much, and certainly could come into play here. We have had a few questions that have come up, and I have a couple of my own. Let me start. This is for both Sam and Michael. A great question from one of our viewers. What about where the business is really brand new? Sam talked about sort of a business that maybe has only been around for a few years or what have you, and what is the appropriate time period to look at. But this question is specifically about it's only been open a few months. So basically there is no net income yet. There's only expenses. What can be done in that kind of situation?
Well, I think one of the things that needs to be done is for the business owner to advocate for other empirical pieces of information that can be relied upon to demonstrate and project what the income would have been had it not been for the covered loss. So I talked about a couple of different methods that are used to measure business income. One of them is the before versus after. That's the more common one. But another is the benchmark approach. And when you have a business that is so brand new that it doesn't have a measurable history of performance beyond a few months, I think it's important to draw upon information that's broader and available in the industry as a whole to demonstrate and substantiate what you believe your income would have been had it not been for the loss. Michael, do you have any additional thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point. Obviously, one of the keys to that type of benchmark approach is comparability. What is the basis or the factual basis for an overlay of what the industry might accomplish versus the specific individual business? It's a little tough to address this question broadly. It would be easier to address with more specific facts. I would just say it's not impossible that there could be a loss. It's certainly, if the business has no revenue, for example, but only expenses, it's going to be, the question is going to be, when would have revenue started? What was the basis for that? And what are the basis for those expectations? You might consider things like, has there been a new business loan that's been obtained where pro formas have been produced and vetted by a CPA that sets the expectations? What is the business experience of the owner, and do they have a successful track record historically? I mean, there's all sorts of different layers that you can add to try and build a case for a potential loss. But if there's a business that had no money, no revenues, only expenses, was operating at a loss, is completely shut down and no longer has expenses, that by itself, if nothing else were to change, would be a scenario of no loss, because there would have been a loss, there's no longer a loss, it's zero. You have to establish how that loss before the fires was going to turn to a profit, or demonstrate that there's still continuing expenses that bring that loss to a collectible level. So lots of different layers there. I would encourage whoever asked that question to work with someone like Sam, perhaps, to get the right people on board to help build that case.
I think it's
Thank you, guys.
particularly, yeah, let me just add in a few more words. I think it's important to be very proactive as an insured submitting this kind of claim, because nobody knows your business better than you do. And what I have seen from insurance companies in my experience is that the kinds of documents that they request, the kind of approaches that they take, sometimes don't fit with the specifics of the business that's being operated. It's not a one-size-fits-all scenario. So if you're being asked to turn over certain kinds of documents, absolutely cooperate, but you might want to be proactively involved in the process to bring other things to the attention of the insurance company to help it better understand the way your business operated.
Great point. Great point. The other comment or question that we had from the viewership was to talk a little bit about egress coverage, and I'll take that one. It's kind of a sister to civil authority coverage. It doesn't come up as often, but it is another coverage that is potentially available to you. And what that means is that the access to the business is blocked, not, without any kind of order from a governmental agency, but literally blocked, like trees have fallen down and blocked access or something like that. It does still require that there have been a physical loss to another property, not your property, but another property within a certain circumference or diameter from where you are. So fairly limited coverage, but it is there, and thank you to the person who raised that question. Another point that came up when Michael was talking was, well, when does the insurance company pay, or when do they have to pay? And so while he was talking, I did look at the standard deluxe business income form, and under loss payment, it says that we will pay for covered loss within 30 days after we receive the sworn proof of loss, if you've complied with all the terms of the coverage part, and we've either reached agreement with you on the amount of loss or an appraisal award has been made. So I guess my question to you, Michael, is do you have any sense as to how long it, the 30 days sounds pretty quick, but how long does it take to get to the point typically where then maybe you've reached an agreement? If there's an appraisal, I assume that you're waiting a pretty long time.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't speak to payment terms because I don't represent the insurance companies or what their obligations are in that matter. All I can tell you is that when I'm working with insurance companies and they're asking me to provide a loss measurement recommendation, that's relevant to their consideration of timing for payment, right? So that's why I said when I was going back to my initial common questions is the faster you get the data to the accountant, the faster we can provide that recommendation, the more it's going to help expedite their consideration for payment.
Sam, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I would underscore what Michael says. That goes to the duty to cooperate. And very often you see scenarios where it takes more time to fully analyze the extent of a company's business interruption losses. But notwithstanding that, there will be a relatively undisputed baseline amount, a lesser amount. And so if you can cooperate and turn in documentation sufficient to show that your company has suffered a loss, you may not get every cent on the dollar at the outset, but you can get advance payments towards your eventual full payment.
That's a great point, Sam.
Okay, and one more question came in while we were talking, last one for the day. Sounds like a Sam question, but with regard to the period of restoration, if there's a delay in repairs due to materials and labor shortages, what is the insured's duty to mitigate? And I'll expand that a little bit to just cover, does the appropriate period of restoration take into account things like repair or shortages, materials and labor shortages? So, well, why don't we start with that?
The short answer is yes, it does. If you are forced to rebuild at a time when there are shortages in labor or materials, those are situations that you have very little ability to overcome. And it will result in all likelihood in a longer period of time for you to restore your business operation. You are entitled to extend the period of restoration to the length of time that it's actually going to take you under the circumstances. Do you have a duty to mitigate? Of course you do. You always do in claim scenarios, but I'm hard pressed to identify efforts that an insured could take to overcome a larger problem where there is a shortage in contractors or materials necessary to restore the business operation.
Great. Okay. Well, we've gone slightly over the hour and we've answered all of the questions. Unless anyone else has anything they want to say, I want to thank everyone for tuning in, whether through the Beverly Hills Bar Association Zoom or later on YouTube. And we wish everyone all the best as they deal with these very difficult circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
This program and the associated written materials are provided for informational purposes only and are not intended and must not be taken as legal advice on any particular set of facts or circumstances. You should not act or refrain from acting on the basis of any content included in this program without seeking legal or other professional advice on your specific matter. This program contains general information and may not reflect current legal developments or address your specific situation. This program and the associated written materials are not intended as a solicitation.